Hola a todos, conmigo aquí está o professor Jan Parker, que tem sido realmente uma lenda viva na psicologia latino-americana. Lembro nossa juventude que desenvolvia uma psicologia social crítica lá finais dos 70, princípios dos 80, que quando o livro de Jan Parker apareceu, La crítica à psicologia social, foi um livro que influenciou profundamente um movimento crítico reflexivo em toda a América Latina. Hoje, em ocasião do 34º Congresso Interamericano de Psicologia, nós temos a honra de ter o professor Jan Parker conosco e, precisamente, vamos a ter uma entrevista que possa chegar a todos os psicólogos no Brasil e também na América Latina. Welcome, Professor Jan Parker. Welcome to the Interamerican Congress of Psychology. Welcome to Brasília. First time that you visit Brasília.
First time in Brasília.
Yes, for us it's really very important to have you here. And I would like to talk with you in relation to your main concerns, your main ideas at this moment, the ideas in your creative and rich thinking, because you have a lot of publication, a long history in psychology, what not mean at all that you are an old person, but I'm really very curious which are the theoretical, the practical, the critical course of your thinking at this moment. And you have, of course, you can feel here very comfortable for standing in depth in whatever you want of my questions and the topic, because when you begin to talk, this is a process that it is very out of control. Okay, Professor, thank you.
Okay, thanks. It's really great to be here. And it's really nice to be here in Brazil with friends who I've been working with for a number of years. And I'm very pleased that my work is taken seriously here. I think the other side of the equation is that the developments in Latin America in psychology, around liberation, social psychology, for example, have been very, very important for us in Manchester and a very important source for critical psychology. I think one of the most important lessons that we've learnt over the years is that psychology in the United Kingdom and in the United States of America is very limited by the culture in which it's developed, and the critiques that we've developed over the years have also been limited by that cultural, historical, political, economic context. And so we found it very important to make links with alternative traditions of critical psychology around the world. Latin America and Brazil have been places where those alternative traditions have been developed. And so we want to emphasize in our work in the discourse unit and in my own writings, the variety of different approaches that there are to psychology and the variety of different theoretical resources that we can draw upon. That's been something that's been the starting point for thinking about psychology now.
It's very interesting because really I perceived first time I met with you and Erika there in Mexico, this openness and this point that you have highlight now, that how any critics is developed inside and within certain cultural and economical and political structure and organization, which always represent limit from our world. And this kind of exchange is fantastic for us. It characterizes you very much. Jan, what do you want to talk in relation, for example, the critics that you have opened in your last words, in your last exposition in Congress, in relation to the institutional matters that are affecting not only psychology, neoliberal society at this moment all over the world, including the universities.
I mean, that context is extremely, extremely powerful as a frame for enabling us to understand what psychology is, the processes that are happening in the economy, the economic crisis and the political crisis, and also the forms of resistance that are developing outside the universities and inside the universities as well. I should say that before I trained as a psychologist, I was a Marxist. And I continue that political affiliation through my work to today. And I remember when I started studying psychology that my comrades in the political organization that I was a member of told me that it was a mistake to be involved in a bourgeois discipline, and that since psychology was an integral part of capitalist society, it would be a mistake to have anything to do with it. But actually that's precisely why I'm interested in psychology, because psychology is such an important component of capitalist society. I have to remember that the discipline of psychology began in the 19th century, exactly at the moment when capitalism was starting to develop, and it's no accident that psychology developed then, because psychology is a form of close monitoring of people's behavior and an attempt to categorize people, and specifically to encourage people to take work as their primary form of identity and to be obedient, good subjects in the workplace. That's been the aim of psychology from the beginning. And so my interest from the beginning has been in the way that psychology operates as a form of control. It appears to be open and democratic and liberal, but the methods in psychology, the mainstream methods in psychology, have been concerned with the discipline and surveillance of people's behavior and cognitive processes that are supposed to be inside their heads. And so that carries on to today with the new economic context, with the development of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism being an intensification of the focus on the individual and the incitement of individuals to feel themselves responsible for economic processes and to take charge of their own lives in order to be entrepreneurs and to defend themselves and to be competitive in order to survive. That neoliberal context also involves the deregulation and privatization of state services, and that has a profound impact inside the universities. Universities should be a space where people have the freedom to think critically about the nature of society and to develop new ideas about subjectivity and the individual. But the universities are also affected by this neoliberal context, have to operate like businesses and become very, very closely connected with the business ethos and the neoliberal way of thinking about the relationship between the individual and society. And so we have a particular task today to think about our place as psychologists in that neoliberal context, to think about the intensification of interest in psychology in conditions of neoliberalism, and to develop critiques of psychology that will enable people to think about their place in the workplace, to think about their place as academic workers, and to make links between workers in industry and workers in the intellectual sphere.
It's very interesting. I wanted to listen that word that appeared in the course of your conversation, the mainstream psychology, because not all psychology. There are even the field of critical psychology that you open and contribute a lot to its development, or to now continue alive. And one of the continue living. And one of the problems, Jan, is that every theoretical path or practical in any science take the risk to become a dogmatism always. Then I think that no one or not any social production or cultural production escaped from the logic of capitalism. But the matter is to generate intelligibility in order to to fight, in order to discuss, in order to open alternative paths, that it is precisely what you are doing. But I think that also characterize, for example, some feeling psychoanalysis, some feeling cultural historical psychologists. For this reason, I don't want to categorize absolutely that psychology is part of the capitalism. Everything is part, but there are parts inside the capitalism that are in higher confrontation with the dominant paradigms. That is exactly what you have criticized right now. The individualistic order, the pathologization of the social behavior, the individual explanation of social conflicts. Very interesting, yeah, very interesting. Jan, what do you want to extend yourself in relation to one of these topics? Everything that you are talking here is very important for psychologists. In all the Latin American countries still prevail and very traditional learning of psychology in Latin America. Even sometimes in some universities, it seems to me that they continue in the first part of the 20th century, humanism, psychoanalysis, Freudian, and behaviorism. What do you have to say us in relation to your idea for the students of psychology, for the preparation of psychology? Because the critique that you enunciated in relation to the universities is one of the problems that affect this development inside universities.
Well, I think the first thing is to realize that there are two aspects of psychology that are absolutely crucial. The first is that psychology limits our understanding of our behavior and our thinking and our emotions. It gives us a certain kind of explanation for why we do the things that we do, and it constrains us in very important ways. And people who take part in psychological studies and who are affected by the promulgation of psychology through the media, the television and the newspapers, learn how to speak in psychological terms. And then when they speak to the psychologists are very happy because they're speaking in exactly the way that they expect people should speak. That's the first issue. People learn to speak how psychologists see them. But the second aspect is that people are always resistant. We emphasize this in our work from the beginning, that where there is power, there is resistance. There's something in the nature of human subjectivity which makes it question the ideas that it's given by those in power. And it refuses. People refuse those ideas. And so there are always forms of resistance, and there have always been contradictions in the discipline of psychology. That's why there have been the contradictions, because people don't believe the dominant stories from behaviorism, psychoanalysis, humanism, cognitive psychology. They think, no, there's something more to the human subject than this. I can see this in my collective behavior, in my community, in my workplace. I can see that there's something more to being a human being than the story that psychology tells me. And we draw on those alternative conceptions of subjectivity in order to build forms of critical psychology. It's very, very important. Also, what's important is, as you say, is always a danger that alternative approaches will become a dogma. And that's the case in the new sub-area which is called critical psychology. Now, critical psychology has been very important to me, but I think we have to realize that there are different forms of critical psychology in different parts of the world.
Yes.
So, for example, in the latest issue of Annual Review of Critical Psychology, which is on the Discourse Unit website, there are 49 articles from critical psychologists in different parts of the world. In fact, there are 8 articles about critical psychology in Brazil, because there are differences among critical psychologists about the paths that we should take. And it's that dialogue, that debate, that contradiction among those who are resisting psychology that is so important for us, that we learn about the varieties of different psychology in everyday life, the different practices that people are constructing in their forms of resistance to capital, to neoliberalism, and to the dominant forms of knowledge in the universities That's what we value, and that's what we want to develop in our work.
Even you have writing about this in some paper review in the annual review of critical psychology.
Yes.
I read this that
Yes.
you are saying, and one of the point important in the journal is that it's open for everyone to access and to read. That it is important also. It is
Yes.
trying to avoid
Well,
the business of the journal at this moment in
yes,
the world.
Yes. You see, most academic journals aren't available for people to read, for ordinary people to read outside the academic world. But we need to make this knowledge open and accessible so people can join with us in that debate. See, and a very important part of critical psychology is that we want to bring together the academic psychologists who are developing new theories and the professional psychologists who are thinking about how to work with people in the schools and the clinics, and, crucially, the people who are actually using the psychology services. So, for example, there are strong movements in different countries of people who have been inside the mental health system, have been in psychiatric hospitals, who have family members who've been diagnosed with different forms of mental distress. And there are movements, political movements in Psychiatria Democratica, for example, in Italy, other like movements, democratic psychiatry movements around the world that we connect with in order to develop a more broad form of critical psychology that isn't only academic, not only professional, but is actually connecting directly with the political process.
Then, really I have interest because something that surprised me so much in some moment of my history
I can hear this coming.
was was when I came one of your books and I liked it, and I saw suddenly that Jan Parker is in dialogue with Lacan. In that moment, I refused Lacan so much. It is not my moment at this today, because Lacan has interesting questions emerged in very important and decisive moment in the French thinking, and it is possible to recognize some faults of the Lacanian thinking that we have to follow, we have to study. But in particular, I'm very interested in what Jan Parker is thinking and how Jan Parker followed that tradition to precisely this core of theoretical ideas, very clear, because you know also, Jan, that Lacanian psychology has been one of the bigger dogmas in the history of psychology, and the cult of personality and so on. So I'm very curious because I guess that you will offer a very interesting explanation, reflections, that it is the more important thing in relation to your conversation with Lacanian tradition. Maybe you will speak a little about that.
Yes, okay. I mean, the first question here is the question of psychoanalysis, and there have been many radical psychologists through the history of psychology who've become interested in psychoanalysis as an alternative to mainstream psychology, and some of those radical psychologists or critical psychologists then become caught up in psychoanalysis as a kind of worldview. Then they become evangelists for psychoanalysis, and that's a real danger. It's something that I was very wary about from the beginning of my work, and so I was very reluctant myself to work with psychoanalysis. But then I came to realize that psychoanalysis is something that mainstream psychology in the English-speaking world, and there's a contextual, political, cultural issue here. Psychoanalysis is something that psychology in the English-speaking world wants to keep out. It wants to shut out, because psychoanalysis is concerned with the unconscious, with desire, with things that escape direct observation and surveillance by the psychologists, not easily theorized within psychological models. If you look at the early history of psychology, you find that many psychologists, like Piaget, for example, were trained as psychoanalysts, practiced as psychoanalysts. And Vygotsky and Luria were two founders of the Russian Psychoanalytical Society in 1922. But you don't read about this in the psychology textbooks. There's something that psychology tries to shut out. And that's why Erica Berman, in her book Deconstructing Developmental Psychology, refers to psychoanalysis as the repressed other of psychology. And in that way, psychoanalysis starts to assume a progressive function as a space of critique of mainstream psychology. And I know that isn't the case in all countries. I know that in Brazil, there are thousands and thousands of psychoanalysts, and there are many of those who are supporters of Lacan, trained as Lacanian psychoanalysts. Now, I think it's important to say, with respect to Lacan, that Lacan was not a Marxist. He was not even very progressive, but he did really, really hate psychology and developed some very important critiques of psychology. And so when I trained as a Lacanian psychoanalyst, and I practice today as a Lacanian psychoanalyst in Manchester, I use that as a space to think critically about the nature of mainstream psychology. There are all kinds of problems in working with people one-to-one in the clinic, in the reduction of problems to the level of the individual. But the psychoanalytic clinic provides a space for people to speak freely about themselves, an opportunity to speak in ways that they never have an opportunity anywhere else to speak in that kind of way. And through the process of speaking about themselves and hearing themselves speak about their past, they make connections which are unexpected, which enable them to shift their subjectivity and to think differently about who they are as human subjects. That's what psychoanalysis enables. It's not a worldview. It's not a complete system of thought which we should adopt as the alternative. Neither, for that matter, is Marxism. Marxism is a political practice specifically to enable us to comprehend capitalism and to overthrow capitalist society. Similarly, psychoanalysis is not a worldview. It's a particular clinical practice that enables someone to think about themselves and to overthrow, if you like, or to have a revolutionary questioning of the way that they have become formed as a subject in capitalist society. It doesn't do any more than that.
This has level that should be differentiated. And
Absolutely.
It's interesting you to point out this. And even also we cannot accuse Lacan of non-Marxism, because Lacan have a very close relationship with Althusser in the time of Marxism, structuralistic Marxism.
Well, yes, if you like to call it.
It's far from the real Marxism.
If you would like to say Althusser is a Marxist, then that's
fine.
No,
Some kind of Marxism. Because remember that Marx wrote to Paulo Lafargue, that his son-in-law, that fortunately he had not Marxism.
Yes.
And it is very important. It is very important to
I'm not a Marxist.
Of course, yes.
Exactly.
Because on behalf of Marx, also the dogma have proliferated everywhere.
Yes.
The poor Marx have been guilty, but Marx has nothing to do with this kind of interpretation. Jan, what do you want to add to your talk with me in this interview? Remember that many psychologists in Latin American will see this interview, this conversation, and it is a very, very special opportunity for you communicating with everyone here in this short time. Do you have something that you want to stand in? Because I want to talk about one book of you, but before do this, I prefer to listen to you if you would like to stand a little about some of the matters that we have discussed.
Well, okay, the other thing that I'd like to say is that when we're developing a critique of mainstream laboratory experimental psychology, which is concerned with the surveillance and control of behavior in a very rigid, positivist way, we also have to be aware that the alternative traditions in psychology that draw on qualitative research and a more humanist tradition are also have to be subject to critique. That is, forms of qualitative research that are engaged with participative action, inquiry, work with communities. We also have to think critically about those approaches as well. And in our work in the discourse unit in Manchester and our networks of colleagues around the world in the discourse unit, we take very seriously the work of Michel Foucault with his analysis of discipline and surveillance in culture today. But we also take seriously the problem of confession, that is, the way that people are incited to speak about themselves in psychological terms to the professional psychologist. And there is a danger in qualitative research that it encourages people to speak openly to the psychologist, and people become recruited into the apparatus of psychology in a soft way. They become part of the regime of psychological truth in which they really believe the psychological ideas. So we need to have a critique not only of the mainstream laboratory experimental tradition that is so powerful in the United States, but also have a critique of the alternative qualitative approaches that are developed in other parts of the world.
You have been into the discussion very interesting point, Jan, and I would like to continue talking about this, because even to talk about qualitative research at this moment did not say nothing, because qualitative research you have and very epistemological positivistic research, very inductive and so on, descriptive. You have one interpretation of phenomenology that is centered on one topic of Husserl, because Merleau-Ponty, other phenomenologists, and even Husserl in the phenomenology of will had another thinking. And we have a lot of confusion because we psychologists used to bring to our fields some philosophical umbrellas in relation to which we have not absolutely prepared for translate to our field and for creating on this philosophical basis. But for example, what I see, it is that the point that you have come into the discussion, it is not only restricted to qualitative methodology, it's also a matter of psychotherapy. The problem is that we cannot impose our language to the other, and they have to find their own language. And when we are making research, we have to get what they say to us. We may interpret this in our way, but it does not mean at all that the language we will explain then is our language. Even I think that the explanation, they then find their own explanation. It is not our matter. The psychologist is a provocator. We have to provocate the dialogue, the contact in the others, but they have to find the ways in which they will follow their own path in relation to any problem, and social intervention, psychotherapy, and even qualitative. What do you think about?
Well, and I can give you an example in relation to questions of mental health, which is something that we've been involved with for many years, particularly through the magazine Asylum, magazine for democratic psychiatry in Britain, where there's a movement of people who hear voices. Now, if you take seriously the American Psychiatric Association Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, then you would believe that to hear voices is a first-rank symptom of schizophrenia. But no, we found that there are many, many people who hear voices for many different reasons, who do not attract a diagnosis of schizophrenia, who live very comfortably with their voices. The danger is that if they come from a culture, say from the Caribbean, a Pentecostalist religion, for example, if they come from a culture in which it is normal to hear voices, they come to Britain, they are unhappy for some reason, and they go to a psychiatrist. If they tell the psychiatrist that they hear voices, then they get a diagnosis of schizophrenia, then they're likely to be put inside the mental hospital. So it's extremely important to develop spaces where people have an opportunity to talk about their own own experiences of hearing voices and their own theories of hearing voices. And that's something that we've tried to do in Manchester, to open up the space of the university to have conferences where people come and give their papers about their theories of, for example, hearing voices or paranoia. And we include in those conferences psychiatrists and clinical psychologists, of course, because they have their theories. But what we're most interested in is the networks of people who have their own alternative theories. Maybe theories of computer models. There may be theories of shamanism. There may be theories of spirituality. But those different theories provide a framework for people to collectively support each other, so that at times of distress, they do not need to go to the psychiatrist, and they don't need to go to the psychologist. That's a very important part of our work.
It is very important, Jan. Here in Brazil, there is a very interesting psychologist, a young psychologist, who is working on this topic. Even his last book is Psychotherapy and Spirituality, Mauricio Neuer from Brasília. Very interesting book. And I, of course, I know very well what you are telling because I am Cuban. And African rituals have a lot of psychological mechanisms that are impossible to integrate to this end, 4 and 5.
Really, psychology developed in the 19th century. Psychology as a discipline will not always be with us, and we need to prepare the way for us to live in a different world where we can live together, tolerating and respecting each other. Yes. And that will be a world, I think, without psychology.
Or with a better psychology, with a different psychology, Jan. Yeah. Maybe, but I also expect that the concept of discipline in that moment
that's the problem.
will be
That's
completely
exactly the problem. The problem is the concept of discipline.
Yes,
discipline of psychology.
Yes, the concept of discipline in general.
Yes.
Then we expect that not only psychology, not anthropology, not sociology,
so we
have another theoretical framework.
Yes.
Okay, bien. Professor Jan Parker, thank you very much for your disposition, for being with us here, for your happy thinking, all the time thinking and discussing. I appreciate so much this in you and in Erica, partners. And really on behalf of the center, the University Center of Brasília, on behalf of Brazilian and Latin American psychologists who are participating in this Congress, I'm really very grateful to you. Thank you very much. Terminando a entrevista con el profesor Jan Parker, aproveito a oportunidade para apresentar um livro do professor que já está pronto em português, verdade? Que é Revolução na Psicologia da Alienação à Emancipação. Este tem sido um livro apoiado e fortemente apoiado pela professora Raquel Gusso da Pontifícia Universidade Católica de Campinas. Estou seguro que é um livro que vai ser muito lido e que vai ter uma influência grande dentro da psicologia no Brasil. Eu quero agradecer, Jan, pela sua disposição sempre para que seus livros sejam aqui publicados, transitem em espanhol, em inglês. Então, em breve, a editora Átomo no Brasil vai ter este livro e nós esperamos poder fazer um lançamento aqui no Centro Universitário de Brasília. Ok, professor Jan.